Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Jhana. Responsible Happiness. July 13, 2009. We start each session with thoughts of goodwill, reminding ourselves of why we're here, and of the fact that the happiness we're looking for here is harmless. That's what goodwill is all about. May all beings enjoy happiness in a harmless way. Of course, that means we need to enjoy our happiness in a way that doesn't take anything away from anyone else. In other words, each of us has to enjoy happiness within. That's why we're here meditating. So the fact that you're not paying attention to anyone else right now is actually a very responsible thing, because you're pursuing a happiness that will make you less of a burden. Any happiness you try to gain otherwise is going to take something away from other people, other beings. Or if you go to the other wrong extreme of self-torture, trying to enjoy some satisfaction out of that, you're not going to enjoy true happiness at all, so that's not responsible, either. As we've seen many times, people go back and forth between these extremes. They can be very self-denying until finally they snap, then they head over in the other direction, getting very self-indulgent. When they see the harm of indulgence, they go back to being self-denying again, back and forth. Nothing gets accomplished this way. Both ways of looking for happiness are irresponsible. The responsible way is to come in and see what inner resources you have that can be developed into a genuine happiness within. As the Buddha once said, your most important resource, the most important factor of the right path, is right view. In another passage he said that the most important factor is right concentration. So you need to emphasize both. Everything else draws on right view and serves right concentration. The right view here starts with what I just said. If you're going to enjoy true happiness, it has to come from within, because the sources of suffering also come from within. We suffer mentally not because of unpleasant things happening to us, but from how we shape our experience of those unpleasant things or of pleasant things, as the case may be. Which means that we need some internal skills. That's what right concentration is for. As you focus on the breath, try to bring your focus to a nice steady spot. Ajahn Lee's image is of a post planted at the edge of the sea. The sea rises, but the post doesn't rise with the sea. The sea ebbs, but the post doesn't go out with the sea. It stays right there. The trick here, though, is to make sure that that steady spot is comfortable. If you clamp down too hard, you're going to put too much pressure on your nerves, too much pressure on the blood vessels in that part of the body, and your concentration will have some bad side effects. It will create weird sensations in the different parts of the body, as the blockage right here interrupts the blood flow and leads to problems somewhere else. So, keeping Ajahn Lee's image in mind, allow the water to flow around the post, but keep your awareness steady with an element of interest. There's going to be something to watch here, something interesting is going to appear here, so have that element of interest to catch what's actually going on. If you enjoy any tension or blockage building up here, think of it relaxing, dispersing, dissolving away. And then think of the relaxation spreading out from that spot, through all the energy channels in the body, through all the nerves in the body. If it needs an escape route out of the body, think of it going out the soles of your feet and the palms of your hands. Another image from Ajahn Lee is that meditation is like medicine. Mindfulness and alertness are the actual medicines. The quality of your attention right now is what's healing both for the body and for the mind. The breath acts as a solvent, helping the medicine to spread throughout the body. When you apply well-balanced alertness and mindfulness to any sense of blockage in the body, it helps to untangle it. The reason these blockages build up is because we're not paying attention to them. Our attention is always someplace else. And so we miss a lot of what's going on right here, right now, in the body and in all the connections between the body and the mind. So wherever you focus on the breath in the body, keep in mind that you want the breath to be comfortable, you want the energy in that spot to be comfortable, the sense of how to be unobstructed. And the results in the body help you to gauge how skillfully you're focusing the mind. In the beginning, it's hard to tell the two apart. When there's a sense of focus, there are going to be physical symptoms around the focus. But with time you begin to see that the focus and the symptoms are separate, so that if you're focusing, say, on the nose or in the middle of the head, the sense of pressure that might build up around that focus isn't necessary. Try to think of whatever escape routes there may be to allow that pressure to disperse a little bit, so it's not so heavy, not too oppressive. Out the top of the head, down the spine, out the hands, out the feet, down the front of the throat, wherever. Where your escape routes are. Use some imagination, because we've all been developing different ways of maintaining focus in the body, using different physical symptoms as a sign that the focus is staying there, or as a reminder to stay at that spot. If some of those symptoms are unpleasant, you have to learn how to let them go, and yet maintain your focus. The how of the energy there is a good way of gauging whether you're doing this skillfully. Once you develop that skill in being both focused and at ease at the same time, alert, attentive, interested, you see how that quality of still awareness can allow patterns of tension to dissolve away and blockages to be opened up. That's when you can bring that same quality of attention to patterns of tension in other parts of the body, around the navel, the middle of the chest, the back of the neck, wherever. Here again, the steadiness and quality of your awareness is the medicine. The breath is a solvent that allows the effects of the medicine to spread through different parts of the body. This is an important skill, learning how to stay focused in a way that's healing, because that's what the Buddha's teachings are all about. Healing. That's what the Four Noble Truths are all about. They're like a doctor's prescription. What's the illness? Where does it come from? Cure the illness by getting rid of the cause. Everything the Buddha taught was meant to be healing, a means to happiness that's blameless. So if you start feeling guilty about practicing concentration, remind yourself this is a blameless pleasure. The dangers of jhana are very minor and mild. If you get really addicted to this pleasure, you might start getting lazy in your other activities, so that's something to watch out for. And you might start getting lazy about the idea of using the jhana to develop deeper insight. You might say, hey, this is good enough for me, and just want to stay right there. The problem, of course, is that it won't last. If the jhana isn't supported by right view, it begins to fall apart. If you're not careful, it can actually strengthen wrong views. Some people hit a state of concentration and then decide, from now on I don't need to watch out after my actions, because I've found the truth, the ground of being, or whatever. But the problem there is not with the concentration, the problem is with the views you bring into it, thinking that it's going to do all the work for you, or that it's all you need to do. So the danger is not in having concentration, the danger is in the wrong views that you might bring to the concentration, or that might prevent you from getting into concentration. For the biggest danger is not having concentration. We hear so much about the dangers of concentration, but the dangers of not having it are a lot worse. If you don't have this pleasure to tap into, you're going to go looking for pleasure in other ways, which can often be quite harmful. As the Buddha once said, even though you may see the drawbacks of sensual pleasures, if you don't have the pleasure of concentration to tap into, you're going to keep going back to your old sensual pleasures. If you go back to them with denial, that just complicates the issue. People steal, kill, have illicit sex, lie, speak divisively, speak coarsely, use intoxicants, not because of their ability to access the pleasure of concentration, but because they don't have that ability. They go looking around for sensual pleasures. People engage in self-torment, and then they get very censorious and very strict with other people for not torturing themselves or tormenting themselves. Or as we see with a lot of Buddhist scholars, they don't have any real concentration, so they say that concentration is self-indulgent, it's not necessary, insight has to be strict and self-denying, and with that attitude, even the insight becomes harmful. It turns into a lot of wrong view. So the dangers of not having concentration are much greater than the dangers of getting stuck on concentration. And again, the stuckness is not so much in the concentration itself as in your views around it. As long as you're very clear that concentration is a path, and that it has to be combined with other factors of the path: right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right eart, and right mindfulness, then it's perfectly safe. This is especially true when you develop the ability to read the quality of your concentration, to read how it affects the breath energy in the body, and to make sure the energy feels balanced, at ease, healthy. In this way your concentration is self-correcting because it's got right view built into it. That's because it's the kind of concentration that listens, notices, it's based on interest citta, which is one of the bases for success. This factor has to be present in all states of right concentration. Whether or not it's the factor you're consciously emphasizing, it's got to be there, paying close attention to what you're doing, noticing where you're adding unnecessary stress, and then learning how to stop doing the things that are causing that unnecessary stress. Even though this inquiry is just on the level of the breath, it's an application of the Four Noble Truths. So this interest is a way of listening to what the body needs as you focus on its various parts. It's as if you ask, what do you need, stomach? What kind of breath energy would feel good right here? Give it what it wants. Then you move to the chest. What do you need, chest? What breath energy would feel good right here? Just pose those questions and try to maintain that steady awareness to watch, to respond. As you learn how to balance the force of your concentration with a sense of well-being in the energy in the body, you find that a lot of the elements of the path come into a balanced relationship. They're healing. That's when you know when you're doing it right. In this way you give all the different parts of the body a chance to tell you what they need. And because a lot of the energy out in the body is related to different issues in the mind, you'll find that parts of the mind that tended to not have a voice now start having a voice as well. You allow them to get healed too. All of this, just as you focus on the breath, is your medicine. Steady awareness combined with interest, monitoring the breath. A source of happiness that harms no one, that's healing to the mind. When the mind has been healed in this way, or even while it's in the process of healing, you find that your relationships with other people are a lot less strained. You're putting a lot less pressure on them because you're putting a lot less pressure on yourself. So again, this is a responsible way of looking for happiness. Don't believe those voices in the mind that say you're being irresponsible as you stay here with the breath, or as you focus attention on your own mind. You're focusing your attention on a source of happiness that doesn't harm anybody. And that's a noble pursuit right there. The uses of concentration. December 29, 2008. Ajahn Lee begins his breath meditation instructions by telling you to breathe in deeply, 3 times or 7 times. Use the wind element in the body to clean things out a little bit. Then allow the breath to end a rhythm that feels just right. See where your sense of ease is right now. Which parts of the body feel okay, not tense, not tight. This may involve a slight trick of perception. We tend to focus on the pains, the tight areas, the problems, and we miss the areas that are actually okay. It's like that book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which teaches how to draw a face by focusing not on the eyes or the nose or the mouth, but on the space between the eyes and the mouth, or between the eyes and the nose. In other words, look at the shapes you ordinarily don't look at, and you find that the drawing comes out looking a lot more realistic. It's the same with the breath. If you have a tendency to focus on the pains and tensions, look instead at the space around them. And give that space some space. In other words, allow it to feel at ease all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out. If you find yourself tensing up, say, at the end of the in-breath or the end of the out-breath, then don't breathe so long. Another common mistake in breath meditation is to try to clearly demarcate the distinction between the in-breath and the out-breath by adding a little bit of squeeze or tension to emphasize the line between the two. That line doesn't really help the breath at all. So think of the in-breath and out-breath as blending into one another. The in-breath is the same element as the out-breath. Allow the sense of well-being to stay constant and continuous. Don't drop it or step on it. Don't squeeze it out as the breath goes out. Give it some space. And that as you're giving it some space, vagrant thoughts may come into the mind. If you were to focus on those thoughts, you'd have to squeeze at that sense of well-being. This means you've got to develop a new habit. Realize that the thoughts are not all that important, especially not now as you're meditating. You don't have to get involved with them. Let them go passing through. As you do this, you're using the concentration for one of its four main purposes, which is to develop a sense of ease and well-being in the present moment. Of the four purposes, this is probably the lowest on the ladder, but it's nothing to sneeze at. We all need that sense of well-being, for otherwise we go through life hungry. Hungry for sensual pleasures, hungry for approval, hungry to shore up a particular idea of ourselves. And as long as you're hungry, you can't really see things for what they are. Everything just becomes food or non-food, and you gobble the food right down. Sometimes you gobble the non-food down as well. Whereas if you can allow the mind to enjoy a sense of well-being simply in the way you breathe, simply in the way you inhabit the body, you can look more objectively at what used to serve as food. That you don't need to feed on all the things you used to feed on. That gives you a measure of freedom right there. It allows you to start looking at the process of feeding more clearly. At the same time, when you develop this sense of well-being, it's a lot easier to look at yourself, at your own motivations, your own intentions. We spend so much of our life soaring from the intentions of other people or focusing on how much we soar from the intentions of other people that we neglect to look at our own intentions to see how much soaring they cause. A part of the mind resists this, a very strong part of the mind. We like to think that our intentions are good, that there's nothing wrong with our intentions. Yet a huge part of the practice requires seeing where our intentions are not skillful. The only way you're going to look at your own intentions with any degree of fairness or equanimity is by getting the mind to settle down and be still, to maintain a sense of well-being, just being right here. When I went to stay with Ajahn Fuang, I was struck early on by the sense that he didn't fully trust me. I thought I was a very trustworthy person and felt a little offended. But in my dealings with him, it soon became obvious that I did have some intentions and ideas that were very strongly unskillful, and I hadn't been willing to look at them. When there were problems, it always seemed that the problem was out there someplace. In him, in the situation, in the other people in the monastery. Only when I was able to gain some sense of well-being in the concentration could I turn around to look at myself and realize that the problem is here, in this need the mind feels to feed on certain ideas. It's like an animal. If it's not disturbed, it'll feed away with no problem. It'll seem perfectly tame, perfectly harmless. But if you start pulling its food away, it'll snap at you and snarl. Those are hard parts of the mind to look at. The best way to do that is to gain a sense of well-being that allows us to look at ourselves more objectively. This is why practicing concentration for a sense of ease and well-being in the present moment is very important. A lot of people want to go straight to equanimity practice, just watching things arising and passing away. Yet you can watch things arise and pass away for the whole rest of your life, but if there's no sense of well-being in the practice, you're going to miss a lot of the arisings and the passings away. You're going to miss the really important ones because you guard them, you hold on to them without realizing what you're doing. So this sense of ease and well-being is the RST goalpost in our practice. It involves having a good mature attitude towards goals. We work toward the sense of well-being, but at the same time we realize that the seeds for the well-being are already here. It's not that we have to sweat and strain and push them into being, or that our pushing and straining will cause them to burst out of nowhere. In fact, the pushing and straining will prevent them from developing. They're already here in a gentle potential form. But we do have to be careful. We do have to watch, to be sensitive, and to show a great deal of restraint in respecting the little pockets in the mind, the pockets in the body, where there's already a sense of well-being that we tend to overlook. To sense the potential for well-being that's already there, you have to look very carefully, with a lot of sensitivity. That's where the ear is directed. Not in exerting pressure on anything, but in being as sensitive as you can to these pockets of well-being, and allow them to grow. Once you've got that sense of well-being, then the Buddha says you can use your concentration for 3 other purposes. One is to gain what he calls knowledge and vision. That's where you develop a sense of light in the body. And that light can become the basis for the dire and psychic powers, or what they call the higher knowledges. These develop for some people and not for others. If they happen to you, you have to learn how to handle them in a mature way. If they don't happen, it doesn't matter, for they're not necessary for purifying the mind. The next purpose of concentration is to develop mindfulness, which the Buddha denesses the ability to keep things in mind, and alertness, which he denesses being able to see thoughts as they arise, as they stay, as they pass away, perceptions as they arise, stay, pass away, feelings as they arise, stay and pass away. In other words, you use the state of concentration as a basis for watching events in the mind without getting involved in the story. Lines or thought worlds you could create out of them. You keep in mind your desire to see them as processes. Now, notice. The Buddha doesn't say that this is insight. It's mindfulness and alertness, just simply tuning into what's actually happening and keeping in mind how to handle it skillfully. The insight that gives rise to the end of the dilemmas is something else. It's the last use of concentration, as a foundation for the ending of the asavas, the mind's fermentations or eluents. That goes deeper. You don't simply watch things arise and pass away. You see how they arise and pass away in dependence on shaky conditions. You gain a larger and larger sense of how little value there is in their arising and their passing away. You come to realize how in the past you've created all sorts of dramas, all sorts of identities, all sorts of worlds out of these things. And they're nothing but very eating events. As the Buddha says, you learn how to see them as empty, ephemeral, not self. You learn to see them as stress. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about seeing whatever arises as stress arising. Whatever passes away as stress passing away. That's not just being alert to things as they happen, but it's also gaining a sense of their value. They're just stress, that's all. The analogy in the canon is of a blind person who has been given an oily stained rag. He's been told that it's a nice white piece of cloth. So he treasures it, folds it up neatly, carries it with him wherever he goes. Then after some time his relatives nally a doctor who can cure him of his blindness. The RST thing he looks at is the cloth, and he realizes he was misled. What he thought was a nice white piece of cloth is actually a soiled rag. All the issues and ayers, worlds and identities, dreams and dramas we build in our lives are made out of oily rags. It's an insight that we don't like to see. But again, it's a lot easier to see this once the mind has had a sense of well-being through the practice of concentration, so that it's not addicted to chewing on rags. Or like that Far Side cartoon with cows feeding in a pasture. One of the cows suddenly jerks her head back, spits out her mouthful of grass, and says, in shock and surprise, "Wait a minute. This is grass. We've been eating grass. That's what we've been eating all our lives. Grass." This is an insight that goes deeper than just watching things arise and pass away. It's seeing the worthlessness of making them arise. For remember, we're not just passive observers of their arising. We're participants in seeing our food. As long as we see the food as desirable, we'll have the energy, the passion, to keep on producing. Only when we see that the food isn't worth it, when we lose our taste for it, will we lose our passion to produce it. For as the Buddha says, once we see things arising and passing away, we have to look for their allure. Why are we attracted to them? And also for their drawbacks. What cost do they entail? The purpose here is to see that their drawbacks are much greater than the allure. We like the dramas. We like the worlds. We have reasons for liking them. But they all fall apart. There's no real substance to them, nothing of any real value, and yet they cause a lot of stress. That insight goes deeper. You see all the sewering that comes from holding on to these things. That's when you truly understand, as the Buddha says, that such is the origination, say, of form or feeling, any of the aggregates, and such is their passing away. This is what the aggregates are all about. Nothing but grass. This may sound depressing, but it's actually liberating. It's like the passage we chanted just now. The world is swept away. It does not endure. And there are a lot of teachings in the Dhamma that are unpleasant sounding but are actually important medicine, just as some of the most effective medicines are bitter. The Buddha teaches these things not to put a wet blanket on people's lives, on their pleasure, on their happiness, but to put the mind in a position where it really can look at these things square on, so it will end in freedom on the other side. The Buddha's teachings never end with a negative. They go through the negative to something positive that lies beyond. For example, as mindfulness of death leads ultimately to the deathless. So the truths we're learning are hard to learn. They're not just about things outside, but also about what's going on in our minds. There's something not quite right about the way we feed, the way we feel we need to feed. The problem isn't with things out there. It's with our intentions, our reasons for feeding. We have to learn how to become skeptical of our own intentions. And the only way to manage that without feeling disoriented, depressed, or discouraged is to have the sense of well-being that comes from concentration, so that you let go not out of discouragement or of sour grapes. You let go because you've found a better alternative. Each time you learn how to let go in the right way, things get better and better inside, because the whole point of all these teachings is to end the ultimate freedom inside. And although the path leading there involves some harsh lessons in looking at our own ignorance, our own craving and clinging, our own unskillful intentions, it also involves developing skillful intentions. Realizing that we do have the potential for skillfulness as well, and learning to use that potential wisely, developing a sense of ease and well-being that enables us to do this work in a more balanced and productive way. Working at home. August 13, 2008. A traditional Pali term for concentration is Viharadhamma, a home for the mind. It's a place where the mind can stay. But it's also more than that. As with any home, there's more to the home than just the bedroom. And there's more to the home than just living in it. First, you've got to build it. And for many of us, that's the hardest part right there. Getting it built. You put up a few posts and they fall down. You put them up again, they fall down again. But you can't let yourself get discouraged because you need shelter. You need a place to keep your valuables. You need a place to rest. And you need a good sheltered place to work. Otherwise, you work out under the hot sun or the cold of winter. So you've got to get the shelter built. You put up the posts again. If you stick with it long enough, you can put up at least something that'll stay. Lean a few pieces of plywood against each other, wrap some plastic around them, and you've got at least some shelter. Then as you get better and better at building, you can build yourself a better and better house until you've got one that's able to give you shelter from most of the vagaries of the weather. You've got a comfortable place to stay. But then you've got to maintain it. This is the next difficulty in the practice. For many of us, once we get the mind into concentration, the immediate question is, what next? The mind just sits there and doesn't do anything, and we get antsy. Well, at RST you've got to learn how to let it sit there and not do anything for long periods of time, not to give in to the antsiness. That requires skill. Making sure you don't get bored, making sure you don't lose your focus, noticing when it begins to unravel, when it begins to fray, and learning how not to get complacent about repairing the little frayed ends. So as soon as the slightest leak develops in the roof, you've got to exit. Otherwise mold sets in and the whole house begins to rot and fall apart. In other words, there's a skill in maintaining the concentration. You learn a lot about the mind in the course of the maintaining. If you take the meditation into your daily life, in other words, trying to keep centered in your center as you go through your various activities, you begin to see very clearly where your attachments are, where the asavas are, the ways your mind owes out to things, barging right through the walls of your concentration. This means you've got a double duty. One is to try to train the mind not to go barging through the walls, and two, to X up whichever walls have been knocked down. In this way you're learning both about the mind's dilemmas and the skills you need to be a good repair person. As you replace the wall, you learn more about walls. You may be able to take what used to be a plywood wall and put up a stone wall in its place. So the maintaining is an important part of the concentration and an important step in developing discernment. But to gain that discernment, you can't simply use the meditation as a place to hide out at the beginning or end of the day. You have to carry your concentration with you throughout the day so that you can use it as a way of gauging the movements of the mind and learning whatever skills you need to rein the mind in when it goes barging out. So those are two of the steps in having a home. One is learning how to build it, and the second one is learning how to maintain it. The third step is learning how to put it to use. For this step, it's good to think of the home as having several rooms and not just one. For most of us, the concentration is just the bedroom. It's the place you go to rest and that's it. But even there you can learn how to use the concentration for more than just simply resting. As in the story of the princess and the pea. When you lie down on your mattress, are there any peas under the mattress? Can you sense them? In other words, is your bedroom really as comfortable as it could be? You can learn a lot just by investigating the bedroom, finding out where the irritants still are. If there's noise outside, how can you insulate the windows so that the noise doesn't come in? Like those hotels and airports where they've learned how to insulate the windows so you don't even know that the planes are taking or landing. How can you insulate the mind? Is it better to shut the windows or to leave them so wide open that the noise goes through and doesn't get lodged anywhere? And what can you do to make the bed more comfortable? There's a lot to be learned right there, for it heightens your sensitivity to even the least little bit of stress that the mind is creating for itself in the very process of staying concentrated. But there's more to the house than just the bedroom. There's also an exercise room, a kitchen, a woodshop, a CNTC laboratory. In other words, it's a working home, a craftsman's home. What this means is that you learn how to use the concentration not just as a place to rest, but also as a place to do your work. To start out, the work can be something very simple. If you've got a big problem in daily life, for instance, a good way of dealing with it is to pose it as a question in your mind before you meditate. Tell yourself, at the end of the meditation session, I want to think about this issue. And then put it out of your mind. Don't let your mind go there while you're meditating, while you're trying to get it into concentration. Only at the end of the hour, or however long the session may be, do you bring up the issue again. And now you're looking at it from the point of view of a mind that's strong and well rested, and the issue should be clear, or at least clearer than it was. Just pose the question in your mind and see what comes up. You may indeed that the new perspective of having the mind still and open makes the solution a lot easier to see. Many people think that once the mind is in concentration you can't let it rest there, you've got to do vipassana right away. Well, yes, you do need to develop insight, but before you get to the really subtle work of insight, you've got other issues in your life that you have to sort out. There's a tendency called spiritual bypassing, where people don't want to face the big issues in their lives, so they use the meditation as an escape, an avoidance strategy, claiming that if they can solve the subtle issues of insight, that'll solve their issues when they're over the cushion. But you can't really deal honestly with the subtle issues of inconstancy, stress, and not self when you haven't sorted through the blatant problems you cause in daily life. This is one of the reasons why traditionally they didn't have such things as meditation retreats. You went to monasteries. And in monasteries, there was time to meditate, but there were also other duties in the course of the day. There was work to be done. You had to interact with the other people in the monastery to at least some extent. And in the course of that work and those interactions, you learned a lot about the Dhamma. The Dhamma of generosity, the Dhamma of virtue, the Dhamma of patience, equanimity, goodwill, all these other virtues that are an essential part of training the mind. The idea of creating meditation retreats came basically in the late 19th or early 20th century, the same time when the assembly line was invented, breaking jobs down into little tiny parts that you do repetitively. This approach to physical work was silent and active, so it became the model for a lot of meditation retreats and for the methods taught on those retreats. You take one method and you just apply it again and again and again. But a lot gets left out in that approach. It's like exercising only one muscle in your body, so that the muscle gets strengthened all out of proportion to the rest of your body. And that can't be healthy. It's better to think of meditation as a training for the whole mind, as exercise for the whole mind. You have to train the whole mind in all the virtues of maturity and heedfulness. In other words, you need to develop the ability to anticipate dangers, particularly dangers in your own behavior, and to guru out what you can do to prevent them. You also need to master skillful suppression, the ability to say no to a state of mind that you know is going to lead you down the wrong path. Traditionally, this virtue is associated with the attitudes of shame and compunction. In other words, you realize that unskillful behavior is really beneath you. Shame here doesn't mean low self-esteem, it actually means very high self-esteem, realizing that your worth as a person shouldn't be squandered on shoddy behavior. Compunction is realizing that if you follow a certain action, the results are going to be bad, and so you want to avoid that kind of behavior. You also want to develop what psychologists call sublimation, the ability to counteract the desire for an unskillful pleasure, binding a more skillful pleasure to take its place. This is one of the reasons why we have the practice of concentration. The mind wants pleasure, so you give it a pleasure that's harmless, blameless, that it can tap into whenever it wants, so that the impulse to go after less skillful pleasure won't be so strong. Then there's altruism or compassion. You have to learn compassion for the people around you, compassion for yourself. And you need a good sense of humor. I don't know the Pali term for a sense of humor, but you see it throughout the texts, especially in the Vinaya. The ability to laugh at the foibles of human nature that led monks and nuns to do unskillful things. Many of the origin stories for the rules really are humorous. They teach you to laugh at that kind of behavior, but it's a good-natured laugh. It's not nasty or mean. It's the recognition that we all have had those impulses, and we can see the foolishness in giving into them. The virtue of humor is that it allows you to step back and separate yourself from what you're laughing at. As the Greeks used to say, the gods laugh. In other words, the gods are up there on Mount Olympus looking down on human beings below, and because they have that sense of distance, they can laugh at human behavior. So when you can laugh at yourself, you're putting yourself in a godlike position, as small g God, separate from your foibles and above them. These are some of the virtues developed as you learn how to live wisely with other meditators, live wisely in a group. Psychologists call these virtues healthy ego functioning, and even though the Buddha never talked in terms of ego functioning, he definitely did teach these virtues as part of the path. So you try to use your concentration as a tool in developing these virtues in the course of the day. Take some quiet time and then look at your behavior. This is like having a bedroom with a workshop right next to it. You get rested and then you can go to work. And even though you may not be directly applying the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self to the V-clinging aggregates, you're learning to take a problem-solving approach to issues in your life, which is precisely the Buddha's approach. The Four Noble Truths are a problem-solving approach, focused on the problem of stress and suffering as a whole, and offering a solution to the problem. As you start applying this approach to the obvious issues in your life, you learn to develop maturity around the application of this teaching. The work then gets more and more subtle, to the point where your workshop turns into a CNTC laboratory, and you're discovering new things about quarks and muons. You can take your precise CNTC equipment and learn more and more precise things about what's going on in the mind, working from the large issues or the blatant issues to the more subtle ones. This is how skill gets developed. You can even extend the image of the house to the point where you start studying the house itself. Take your microscope to look at the beams in the carpet, to analyze the molecules in the air. There's lots of stew in the house to study. And it's all right here. So if you get the mind still and end yourself wondering what to do next, the answer is that you've got to take care of the stillness. Remember, it's a house. It's not a movie show. You're not looking for entertainment. The house doesn't have to be entertaining. The prime requisite for a house is that it's restful, that it offers good shelter. But then the Buddha saw that you can do more with a house than just shelter and rest. You can make it a working home. In other words, you learn not only how to build and maintain your home, but also how to use it as your workshop. You not only develop and maintain concentration, but you also put it to use. This was the big difference between the Buddha's approach to concentration and that of his two teachers. His two teachers saw concentration simply as a place to rest, and that was it, whereas the Buddha said, no, you can actually work in here as well. There's more to be done than just resting. You work and analyze, you discover new things about the mind. And if you're still looking for entertainment, that's the best kind of entertainment there is. The joy of developing a skill, the joy of discovery. So it's good to have a large sense of what this image of the Dhamma or home for the mind means. You learn how to build it, you learn how to maintain it, and then you use it as your workshop, working from crude problems up to the more subtle ones. So whatever stage you're in, the building stage, the maintaining stage, or the working stage, remember to keep this image in mind so that you get the most use out of the home. The practice of right view. April 22, 2009. When there's a talk during meditation, don't focus your attention on the talk. Focus on your breath. The purpose of the talk is to act like a fence, to catch you when you wander away from the breath, to keep pointing you back to the breath. Because it's right at this spot where the mind and the body meet at the breath, here in the present moment, that your practice takes place. That's where you're going to see all the things you need to see, and do all the things you need to do in the practice. The talk is to help keep you focused here, and to give you some perspective on what you're supposed to be looking for, what you're supposed to be doing. Last year I received a phone call from someone who was doing a thesis on using Buddhist teachings and practices in the workplace. He wanted to ask me some questions as part of his thesis. One of the things that bothered me about his questions was that he would ask about Buddhist teachings and then about Buddhist practices, as if they were two different things. But they're not. Everything is part of the practice. Even the more abstract and theoretical teachings are meant to be used for pragmatic purposes when appropriate. After all, right view is part of the path. It's something to do, to develop, to be applied. When it's done its work, you let it go. Right view comes down to the Four Noble Truths, and the Four Noble Truths are based on one of the Buddha's really categorical, across-the-board teachings. That you want to abandon unskillful behavior and engage only in skillful behavior. In other words, we're working on a skill here. The things we intentionally do with our body, with our words, and with our thoughts all count as karma, and they all have results. There's no such thing as idle thinking. It may be idle in its intent, but it actually has an impact on the mind. It's something you're doing, and it leaves karmic traces. Just as the Buddha discouraged idle aimless speech, he also discouraged idle aimless thinking. So learn how to look at your thoughts in terms of what they do, the impact they have on the mind. The Buddha himself said that he got on the right path when he started dividing his thinking into these two types. Thinking that was harmful and thinking that was harmless. In other words, he classed his thinking by the skillful or unskillful impact it had on the mind. From that distinction, the rest of the path grew. In his time, most Indian philosophers got worked up about issues concerning the nature of the world and the nature of the self. But the Buddha didn't get involved in those issues, didn't answer any questions that would drag him into those issues, because he saw that they weren't helpful in putting an end to suffering. Many people got frustrated with him because they couldn't get a clear answer out of him on what they thought were the really important questions. They mentioned this once to one of his lay followers and said, "This Buddha of yours, he's a nihilist. He doesn't teach anything at all." The man said, "No, that's not true. He teaches what's skillful and what's not skillful." Afterwards, the man reported this conversation to the Buddha, and the Buddha praised him. He said, "That's the right answer, the right way to deal with those people." When the Buddha was critical of other teachers, it was most frequently over their inability, 1. to explain what is skillful or unskillful, or 2. to provide an understanding of why it's important to act in a skillful way, and to avoid unskillful behavior. So this is what we're here for, to use his explanation of these issues as an aid in developing a sense of skill with the mind. And even with skillful thinking, he said there are times when it's even more skillful to let the mind rest in right concentration. It's another factor of the path. In fact, it's one of the central ones. There's a passage where the Buddha refers to the other 7 factors of the path as aids, as requisites to right concentration. Right concentration is the important one, the RST factor of the path that the Buddha himself discovered. So that's what we work on. And in the process, we bring in the other factors as they are needed. So learn how to make the mind content to be staying with the breath, staying right here. The mind has a tendency to think and evaluate, so use it. To think and evaluate the breath. How does the breathing feel? Where do you feel it? How many layers of breath energy are there in the body? When you breathe in, what's happening in the different parts of the body? When you breathe out, what's happening? Do you know the places where you tend to hold on or to force the breath or to squeeze the breath in an uncomfortable way? Can you learn to breathe in a way that doesn't involve that holding or forcing or squeezing? That's taking the question of skillfulness and applying it right here, right now. How can you skillfully relate to the breath so that it's easier to stay with, so that staying with the breath induces a sense of ease, of fullness? As you begin to feel that ease and fullness, learn to protect it. In the beginning it may feel simply like a neutral sensation, nothing painful yet nothing outstandingly pleasant. But just protect that neutral feeling for a while, and you'll begin to see that it does grow more and more pleasurable. Then think of that pleasure seeping easily throughout the different parts of the body. If there's a sense of blockage in any spot, think of allowing it to open up. If you sense a blank space in some part of the body you can't account for, say, where your hips should be, try to approach from the back down to the hips, and from the legs up into the hips, to see where the connection is. There are lots of things you can do to make the breath interesting. And it is an interesting phenomenon, this breath energy in the body. It enables us to live. It enables us to move around. Without the breath, we'd be dead. It's what animates the whole body. It's the connection between the mind and the body. So it's good to explore. As you explore the breath in this way, you're getting some basic hands-on practice with the 4 Noble Truths. Where is there stress? What's causing the stress? The stress can be caused either by ignorance or by craving. So as you get to know more and more about the breath, you're doing away with ignorance around the breathing process, what's called in technical terms the process of bodily fabrication. You bring more awareness to the process. As you do this, you'll notice that you may have some subtle craving around the breath. You may prefer the in-breath to the out-breath, so you make it longer than is really good for you. Or you have gotten to like some subconscious ways of forcing the breath sensations, but ultimately they create problems. They create stress. So you're beginning to see some of the causes of stress right here in the present moment, simply in the way you breathe. As you let the mind settle down, you're developing the path. It's important to use these 4 Noble Truths as a framework because they help give you an idea of what you need to do. That's why the Buddha set them out as right view, because each of them involves a task. Stress is to be comprehended. In other words, look at it so that you really understand it, so that you stop identifying with it or seeing it as happening to you, and see it instead simply as an event connected with movements in the mind. When you see the movements of the mind that cause the stress, and you see that they're unnecessary, then you abandon them. It's important to be clear about that. You don't abandon the stress. You abandon the cause. It's like coming into the kitchen and it led with smoke. The RST thing you do is to run to the stove or oven and turn on the aim, or run to the electric box and turn on the power to the oven or stove. In other words, you don't try to put out the smoke, you put out the aim. Here the aim is the craving and the ignorance. Those are the things you want to abandon. Once the aim is out, then the smoke will dissipate. And you're knowing what to do in doing it. That's the path. You want to develop that as completely as you can, because your knowledge of the path will get more and more precise, more and more subtle as you work with it, until ultimately you can begin to realize for yourself what the ending of stress is like. So these categories are here not just to talk about or to think about. You talk about them and think about them for the purpose of using them. Figuring out how you're soaring right now and how you might apply the categories to what you're doing right now. There's a story about Chow Kun Na, who was a famous meditation monk in Bangkok. One night as he was doing walking meditation outside his hut, a young monk came running up to him and said, "I've been thinking all day, and I can't stop thinking." Chow Kun Na looked at him and said, "You're doing the wrong task." That's all he said, and then he went into his hut. But the young monk had enough knowledge about the Four Noble Truths to realize, oh, I've been developing the cause of soaring. What I should be developing is the path. That was enough to bring him to his senses. Ajahn Fuang tells of how he was once sick with a chronic headache that would last for days on end. It got so bad that other monks would stay in his room at night, in case he woke up in pain. One night after midnight he woke up in pain and, as he got up, he looked around. All the monks who were supposed to be looking after him were sound asleep. He said to himself, "Who's looking after whom here?" But then he said, "Well, as long as I'm awake, I might as well meditate." So he sat in meditation. As he was looking at the pain, he suddenly realized he'd been doing the wrong thing. He'd been trying to get rid of the pain when actually the pain was something to be comprehended. So that's what he did, and that shift in understanding proved to be a real turning point in his practice. The categories of the Four Truths are here to help you to realize what you should do, and to catch yourself if you're applying the wrong task, if you're trying to let go of good things or develop unskillful things. If you can catch yourself doing that, then you can switch around. Ultimately your appreciation of these categories gets so subtle, so rened, that as Ajahn Mun says, they all become one. In other words, they nearly get to the point where there's just one task. Letting go, totally. Because after you've dealt with the blatant forms of stress and let go of the causes, you begin to realize that the only thing left is the path doing its work. The only stress still in the mind is the stress of the path, because there's a subtle level of stress that keeps concentration going, that keeps discernment active. In other words, even the path is stress, the cause of stress, and so at that point you let go of it. As for the cessation of stress, there are passages in the canon describing how people touch the deathless and yet develop a passion for it. The passion for the deathless then becomes their one remaining obstacle. They've got to learn how to let go of that too. That's why the Buddha said that all phenomena are not self, because you hit a place in the practice where you're latching onto your experience of the deathless. You have to learn how to not identify with that. That, too, becomes something you let go. When you do that, you reach the ultimate end of the practice. So these Four Noble Truths are tools for getting you to the point where they all collapse into one, so there's one duty left. The duty of letting go all around. But until you reach that point, it's wise to keep these four categories in the back of your mind, along with their underlying principle. The idea of skillfulness, that we're here to develop a skill, to act skillfully, speak skillfully, and to think skillfully. You realize that there really is a difference between skillful and unskillful behavior, just as there's a real difference between the pleasure and pain they cause. Keep that distinction in mind. Remind yourself that everything the Buddha taught was meant to be used as a tool on the path at one point or another. Sometimes some teachings may not be the right tool for you right now. As the Buddha said, Words have to be evaluated as to whether they're true or false, but even if they're true, you want to say only things that are being beneficial. And even if they're true and beneficial, you have to look for the right time and right place to say them. So apply that same principle to your thinking. Are these thoughts true? Are they beneficial? And is this the right time and place for that thinking, that teaching? If it's not, let it go for the time being. Like right now, this is the right time and place to stay focused on the breath, bringing all your attention to how you can get the mind to settle down here. And as long as that skill hasn't been mastered, that should be your top priority. Other issues can wait. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.